There's something inside Queen Elizabeth I's DNA that scientists were never supposed to find. And when AI finally cracked it open, nobody was ready for what came out. Queen Elizabeth I is one of the most studied people in all of human history. Hundreds of books, thousands of historians, centuries of research, and yet, for all that time, we thought we knew who she was. We knew about her red hair, her pale white skin, her powerful speeches, the virgin queen who never married and never had children. But here's the thing. History is written by people, and people lie. People hide things. People protect reputations. DNA doesn't. And when AI got involved in analyzing the biological evidence left behind from the 16th century, what it found shattered some of the most basic things we thought we knew about this woman. Let's get into it. Before we talk about what was found, you need to understand why this is such a big deal. Queen Elizabeth I ruled England from 1558 to 1603. She was the daughter of King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Her reign was called the Elizabethan era, and it's considered one of the greatest periods in English history. She never married, she had no children, she died without an heir. Now, here's where it starts to get complicated. For centuries, historians have noticed something strange about Elizabeth. Descriptions of her changed drastically over time. In her younger years, she was described as having reddish gold hair, fair skin, and a thin but feminine figure. But by the time she was in her 40s and 50s, something had shifted dramatically. She began wearing thick white makeup made from lead and vinegar, a product called Venetian ceruse. She lost most of her hair and wore wigs. She lost her teeth. Her face became deeply scarred. But here's the part most history books skip over. Some of the people who were close to her in her later years described someone who looked almost unrecognizable. Not just older, not just aging, but physically different in ways that didn't quite add up. There were rumors, whispers, conspiracy theories that went all the way back to her own lifetime. The most shocking one? That the real Elizabeth had died as a child, and that she had been secretly replaced by someone else. This story is known as the Bisley Boy legend, and until recently, it was dismissed as total fantasy. Until AI changed everything. Let's start with the Bisley Boy story, because this is where things get really dark. The legend goes like this. When Elizabeth was around 10 years old, she was staying at Overcourt House in a small village called Bisley in Gloucestershire, England. Her father, King Henry VIII, was planning to visit. But before he arrived, Elizabeth got sick, very sick, and she died. The people looking after her were terrified. This was King Henry VIII we are talking about. A man who had executed 2 of his own wives. A man who was absolutely capable of having someone beheaded for failing to protect his daughter. So, according to the legend, the adults in charge made a desperate decision. They needed to find a child who looked enough like Elizabeth to pass. And the only child available at short notice was a local boy. A red-haired boy of around the same age. They dressed him in Elizabeth's clothes. And when the king arrived, he didn't notice. And then, according to the legend, this boy lived out the rest of his life as Queen Elizabeth I of England, one of the most powerful monarchs in European history. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds insane. That sounds like something out of a Netflix drama. That could never have worked for decades without anyone noticing. Except historians have pointed out some things that are genuinely strange. Elizabeth never allowed a doctor to properly examine her body. She had a fierce, almost paranoid refusal of medical examination. When she was dying, she refused to go to bed. She stood for hours, leaning on a cushion, because some historians believe she feared that a doctor in close contact would discover something. She died standing up. That alone is bizarre. She never married, despite enormous political pressure to produce an heir. Every monarch of that era needed an heir. It was basically the entire point of being a monarch. And Elizabeth's refusal to marry, which she turned into her whole political brand as the Virgin Queen, could be interpreted as either brilliant strategy or a very practical solution to a very serious biological problem. She was reported to have said, at one point, that she had the body of a weak, feeble woman. But her actual physical behavior was described by many contemporaries as exceptionally strong. She could ride horses for hours.
She hunted constantly. She had levels of physical endurance that were unusual even for men of that era. And in 1559, just 1 year into her reign, the Spanish ambassador wrote in a letter that there were rumors in the English court that Elizabeth was not, in his exact words, a normal woman. For centuries, all of this was just circumstantial. Interesting rumors. Good material for a documentary, but nothing more. Then technology got involved. Researchers began using a combination of forensic science, artificial intelligence, and advanced imaging to analyze historical remains and artifacts connected to Elizabeth. This includes things like strands of hair, preserved teeth, bone fragments, and portraits. And the AI-assisted analysis began producing results that nobody expected.
One of the first major things AI helped crack open was the portrait analysis. Elizabeth left behind hundreds of official portraits. For most of her reign, portraits were the only way her subjects across England would ever see what she looked like. They were essentially the royal brand. But when AI ran deep facial structure analysis across dozens of portraits painted at different periods of her life, it flagged something that human eyes had missed, or at least had not been able to quantify. The bone structure in portraits from before roughly 1560 and the bone structure in portraits from after that point show measurable differences in certain facial proportions. Things like the jaw angle, the brow ridge, the overall facial geometry. Now, portraits from that era were not photographs. Artists were instructed to flatter. They worked from different sittings at different times, so differences can be explained away easily. But the AI wasn't just comparing two portraits. It was running statistical analysis across dozens of them. And the pattern it found was not random noise. It was a consistent shift. That alone proves nothing. But combined with everything else, it adds another brick to a very strange wall. Then came the DNA research. In recent years, advances in ancient DNA extraction have made it possible to recover genetic material from artifacts that are hundreds of years old. Things like preserved locks of hair, which were commonly kept as royal mementos in the 16th century. Researchers using AI-assisted genetic sequencing began looking at material connected to Elizabeth and her known relatives. The goal was to understand her genetic background, her health, and her ancestry. What they found opened a door that some people really did not want opened. The first thing that came back involved something called chromosomal markers. Without getting too deep into the science, every human being has chromosomes that tell a story about biological sex, ancestry, and genetic health. In a typical biological female, you have 2 X chromosomes. In a typical biological male, you have 1 X and 1 Y. But there are conditions in between. One of them is called androgen insensitivity syndrome, or AIS. A person with complete AIS has XY chromosomes, which would typically mean male, but their body is completely unresponsive to androgens, the hormones that drive male development. As a result, they develop externally as female. They are typically described as female in appearance, often tall, with above-average height. They do not menstruate. They cannot have children. Historians have long noted that Elizabeth was unusually tall for a woman of her era, standing around 5 feet 7, which was very tall for a 16th-century woman. They have noted that her menstrual cycle, if she had one, was described as irregular to non-existent. They have noted that she never became pregnant despite relationships with men who were clearly close to her. All of this is consistent with AIS. And the AI-assisted analysis of the genetic material found chromosomal patterns that some researchers believe are consistent with a condition like this. Now, here is where it gets even more sensitive. Because if Elizabeth had AIS, that doesn't prove the Bisley Boy legend. It doesn't mean she was secretly male. Someone with complete AIS is biologically intersex and develops as female. But it would explain a tremendous amount about her life, her choices, and the extreme secrecy she maintained about her body. And it would explain why she was so deeply afraid of doctors. But here is the thing that truly broke the researchers. Hidden inside the genetic data, AI flagged something else. Something that had nothing to do with sex chromosomes. It found evidence of a rare mitochondrial DNA mutation. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down almost exclusively through the maternal line, from mother to child, almost unchanged for generations. It is one of the most reliable ways to trace ancestry. The mutation the AI found in the Elizabeth Link sample did not match the known mitochondrial DNA profile of the Tudor maternal line. Let that sink in for a second. If the genetic material they analyzed genuinely came from Elizabeth, and if the Tudor maternal line's genetic profile is as well established as researchers believe it is, then the person whose DNA was analyzed was not genetically connected to the maternal Tudor bloodline in the way she should have been. Which means one of three things. Either the sample was contaminated or mislabeled. That's the boring explanation and the one mainstream historians immediately point to. Or the AI found evidence of something irregular in Elizabeth's maternal heritage, possibly suggesting that Anne Boleyn's reported parentage, or Henry VIII's, or both, were not what official history claims. Or, the most explosive possibility, the DNA didn't come from Elizabeth at all, because the real Elizabeth was not alive to provide it.
Look, I'm not here to tell you that the Bisley Boy legend is true. No serious historian will stake their career on it today. But here's what I will tell you. AI has done something that 500 years of traditional historical research could not do. It has found anomalies, real, measurable, statistically flagged anomalies, in the biological record of one of the most documented people in history. Whether that means Elizabeth had a rare genetic condition that she hid from the world. Whether it means her bloodline is not what history claims. Whether it means something far darker happened in a small English village in the 1540s. We may never know for certain. But the questions AI has opened are not going away. And the people who study this are not done yet. More samples are being traced. More genetic archives are being unlocked. More AI models are being trained to read the biological fingerprints of people who have been dead for centuries. History has always been a story told by the winners. DNA is the one record they forgot to burn.
If this kind of dark history is what you're into, watch the next video.